Let me quickly share my screen. Please let me know once my screen is visible. Hope
Yes, I see.
it's okay. Thank you. Okay, so welcome everyone to Bangalore MuleSoft Meetup chapter 23rd. Today's topic is Mule and cloud storage using Azure Data Lake Generation Second. So, safe harbor statement. Both the speaker and host are organizing this meetup in individual capacity. We are not representing our companies. This presentation is strictly for learning purpose. Organizer or presenter do not hold any responsibility that same solution will work for your business requirement. This presentation is not meant for any promotional activity. Housekeeping. We'll be recording this session and the same will be posted on the chapter page within 24 hours. Uh, let's make this session more interactive. You can ask the question and also you can type your questions in chat box. Um, in the middle of the session, the speaker, Ryan, can give the answers. At the end, please give us feedbacks. It is really, really important for us to make it more informative and useful. Organizers, we have Rajesh, Prithvi, Gaurav, myself, Bharat, and Piyush. And so we have a speaker, Ryan. He don't require any knowledge from me. Okay, Ryan, please take it from here. I'll stop sharing.
Sure, welcome everybody. I always like getting with a group of people who get together for no other reason than just to learn our trade. I don't know if you saw in my little bullet points, but I do software and I've done software for a long time because I think it's a good thing that I can have a job doing this. um, because I probably would be doing it if I couldn't. Now I need to get this because of the promise about the chat. Sorry, I want to make sure I keep the chat up on my other screen. That way I can see if you
No,
guys have.
no worries. In the middle, when you take a pause, I'll be asking you if some question comes. So that's fine.
Okay, good. And I think,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
let me fix this. For some reason, the audio is not. So let me fix that briefly.
Sure.
Okay, good. So, yeah, it's great. Again, it's great to hang out with a bunch of software enthusiasts like me. So I encourage you all, anybody here who is the same and who's interested in Mule, because Mule is powerful software and you can use it for to do powerful things. I have a meetup too in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and any of you want to do a talk, I invite you to send me a message on the MuleSoft community Slack, and maybe you could do one back here in America, because it's 10:30 in the morning. I know you guys are up late. Some of you had client calls. I'm fresh in the morning after my coffee. After actually, I had a meeting right before this too. So that's the invitation. And again, the motto at the bottom: always keep learning. Uh, that's a way of life. So let's learn a little bit about storage. So we're talking about data. I wanted to put this talk together to investigate using storage as part of integration solutions in general. And since we run Mule in the cloud or on Runtime Fabric or on sometimes on our own servers, um, we have choices about where we want to keep data. Now, this might be data related to actual API behavior. So the example I put together, it's data submitted by users of your API, like the client is a mobile app or something and they take a selfie. That would be some data you could store, right? You also, in my work, I use storage solutions, and not only Azure Storage, you could try different things. I use Azure Storage as a way to store reliability data. So if I have something that needs a manual retry, or so maybe a file received from a business partner and I need to put it somewhere so an admin can look at it and fix it before it gets submitted. There's a lot of times that you have a use for just generic data storage as a part of an integration solution. So one way you could do that is using Microsoft Azure. There are many other ways you can do that, so I'm not really presenting today that this is the best way or the worst way. It's just a good way. So we're going to look at the way to use Azure Storage as a way to store your integration data. So some of the benefits are, especially above and beyond object store, right? The Azure Storage is inexpensive. It's not free like object store, but it's inexpensive, um, and it's very reliable. Like it's multi-region, replicated, backed up. It's very reliable. It's fast. And you can secure it. It has security features with authorizations, and it allows IT admins to browse and upload and download the data that's in there. So that's all. If that's the features of using this as a component of your integration solution. So if you choose to use it, we're going to look at how to use it. So this is going to be a much more technical talk. We're not going to stay here in the architecture. So let's look at the features and functions that matter to us about Azure Storage. Azure Storage, so Microsoft Azure is a cloud provider, and when you create an account, you have the option to create storage accounts. You can have as many storage accounts as you want to create inside your Azure account.
Ryan, sorry to interrupt, but we don't see your screen.
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
yeah. Now I can see the chat window.
Thank you. Oh, I'm sharing a window. Thank you for that. Let's try this again. This whole time I was on my slide. Huh.
Okay,
Okay, I want the entire screen. There we go. Thank you for that.
you're welcome.
So, yeah, that's the slide you missed. Now it's on the recording. So you can pause the recording if you want. Um, let's get a little more technical about Azure Storage now that we can see the slides. So first, an Azure Storage account is it's a configuration item you can create inside your Microsoft Azure account. So you create a storage account, and a storage account is built separately. It has a region. You're going to create it in a region, and it contains various storage units that might be useful to your Mule application. So you can create all these different kinds. Containers are the one we're going to focus on today the most because they're very useful for blob storage. And a blob is just a unit of binary data. So you could put anything in there like a file contents or an image or whatever goes in a blob. Okay. There's another layer of storage you can use called a file storage, and that makes file shares like classical Windows file shares. That's possible in a storage account as well if you want to be able to do native operating system file shares. It even has a feature for low-end tables. Now it's kind of legacy. The tables have moved. There still are Azure Storage tables. I would not recommend using them in your Mule application because that same API for the Azure Storage tables is now available elsewhere in Azure in another product called Azure Cosmos DB. So if you're going to do the table storage, I actually suggest you just do that in Cosmos and not in Azure Storage. They're very cheap, right? And they really are just like database tables. So you can still do that in an Azure Storage account, and I don't recommend using that particular Azure feature. And then there's queues. And again, it's a very low level basic queue implementation. And Azure has another one called Service Bus that's probably worth its own meetup talk if one of you wants to do Service Bus, or maybe you already have at the Bangalore. 23 meetups is a lot of meetups. So maybe somebody's already done Service Bus, I don't know. So we are really going to focus on containers, which to me is the sweet spot. It's the most fundamental unit of storage, and it's very well supported, and it's the strongest feature of Azure Storage accounts. So when you set up an Azure Storage account, you have to make some choices. So in your Azure portal, and I encourage you, you can all do this for free. If you don't already have a Microsoft Azure account, you can go make one, and they give you some free credits when you first make one, so developers like you and I can learn. So you go make an Azure account on portal.azure.com, and you're going to choose your region and your performance and your redundancy. And then there's a feature called hierarchical namespace that's really important for my talk here, because it's the more modern way to do Azure Storage is with hierarchical namespace, which makes it match probably what you're used to with most file storage, that you have directories, or at least it seems like directories. It's a feature that acts like directories. And enables all these additional features that you can use with your Azure Storage account if you want to. Now, for Mule integrations, the only one I think is super important is Data Lake, although sometimes for legacy integrations, you might also want to use the SFTP feature. That way you can serve SFTP to your business partners or something. But we're going to focus on Data Lake Storage Gen 2 today. Now, I'm not just going to do slides. We're going to do this. We're going to set one up. So I've got it ready to go in my Microsoft Azure account. Now, this one isn't the free account anymore because I've had it a long time and I've used up all the free credits. So I'm paying for it, but I'm not paying very much. As you can see, I've been doing it in a few meetups now. So we're going to create a new storage account. So you could follow along and do this yourself. Now in Azure, your resources are always organized into something called a resource group. So you're going to have to make a resource group if you don't already have one. So I made one for meetups. And then you're going to name the storage account something. So this is Bangalore Meetup 01. And I looked it up. You guys, I saw you. I've never been to India, but I saw that you're in the South India region. So I picked the South India region for this one. And you don't need the premium storage until you know you need it. So when you're doing yours, just set up the standard storage. And I'm not going to choose geo-redundant. So when you first create a storage account, you can choose geo-redundant storage and all the data gets backed up to another region. Like in the whole other, like you could have it backed up to Central India or West India, or you could have it backed up to South Central United States if you want it in my region. That's where I'm at. So um, I'm going to use locally redundant storage because it's cheaper. And when you're learning, cheap is good, right? So we're going to use the cheaper storage. Now, let's see. So that's where we chose the region and we chose the redundancy and performance features. So that's all just on the very first screen when you set up your storage account. So, okay, we're going to go, I'm going to kind of go through the rest of these features, these options for things that you are going to care about. I do think you should turn on Azure Active Directory authentication, and what we're going to use for Mule is going to use that as well, but not for the portal part. We don't really need key access. That's a legacy way to do access to your storage account, so I turn that off. And we don't really need public access for learning either. You can make a publicly accessible container, but we're not going to do that. So I'm turning those two off. So let's see. Now this was the important option, hierarchical namespace, because we're going to use a Mule connector that requires Data Lake Storage Gen 2. So if you're going to do the example, you probably want that as well. And we don't need to turn any of these on unless you're curious, which you might be curious, and then you turn those on. the SFTP and NFS and stuff like that. Some of you might be curious. So I am going to leave public access from all networks on, because otherwise you have to make a virtual net, and this presentation is not about private networking. So we're not going to make a virtual network. So let's see. I don't think I need any more changes to these configs. You can leave the defaults on data protection, and you can leave the defaults on encryption, and just create your storage account. That's how easy it is. It'll take a second for it to check all my options. And then Azure is going to provision a whole new storage account in my Azure account. So it'll show up here as a deployment progress. So that's how you set your storage account up. Now, just because you've created one, we still need to enable access to your storage account. So I want to talk a little bit about authorization. You saw me disable one of those features, which was called access keys. Azure Storage is a very old product. I think it's over 10 years old. And when it first was released, the security was based on access keys, which are just a shared secret that you download from the portal and you put in your code and you use that. And then later, they came out with a more sophisticated option called shared access tokens, which can be rotated and they can only have, limited permissions. So that was nicer than access keys. But now the modern way to do it is to use Azure Active Directory for your authorization and your authentication both for the storage account. That's used for both user access, like you and me in the Azure portal. That's the checkbox I turned on in the setup. And there's another type of access called service principal. So in Azure, a service principal is an account that represents a computer program or a process rather than a human being like you. So we're going to use a service principal for Mule to access the storage account. So in order to make a service principal in Active Directory, one of the ways to do it, there's many, there's a lot of options in Azure. We're going to focus on one of the ways to make a service principal, which is to create an app registration in your Azure Active Directory. And then the app registration is going to have a client ID and it has a client secret that you have to create. And then those are the credentials to access the storage account. So let's look at how to do that. Looks like my deployment of my storage account is complete. So you will be able to see Bangalore Meetup storage account here. And if you look, there's the access keys. So the access keys feature, which I thought I turned off, it is turned off. It tells you right there. So it has the keys, but they don't work. So that's the used to be how you connected. So we're not going to use access keys. We're not going to use shared access signature, which is the more, the fancier version of access keys, because you can set all these permissions. We are going to use access control, which is identity and access management, right? Now, we don't have a service principal yet. So you would come into access control and you create a role assignment to allow a certain identity to access this storage account. And you can come into role assignments and add one for the different people and groups that should be able to log in and use the storage account here in the Azure portal. Maybe your system administrators or your other developers, you might add them with access here. That's also useful for local development. We are going to go use a service principal. So in order to do that, you have to get out of the whole storage account screen. You have to go all the way back to Active Directory and create a new app registration. So in Active Directory, the menu on the left has app registrations. That's where you make a new service principal. So you create a new registration. And we're going to call this Bangalore. I don't remember the abbreviation you used. Is it BL something? So I'm just going to type Bangalore SP01. How about that? I don't think I use spaces. Yeah, Bangalore SP01. I'll do it like this. And you don't need to choose the more complex options here. We just register it. So that creates a new identity. And you'll see some numbers here or some IDs here on the overview when you create one. You want to pay attention to the application client ID because that's kind of like your username that you use to log in with the software. And you're going to also need the tenant ID later on when we use the Mule connector. So you'll use two of these identities, and you never need to use the object ID, and that's confusing. So just don't worry about the object ID. All right, but we don't have a secret. So after you create an app registration, you go through the menu in the Active Directory and you create a secret. You click on certificates and secrets, you generate a new client secret, and you have to give it an expiration because client secrets they don't live forever like they do in any point platform. They all expire sometime. So I like to put a description. This is live secret in Meetup, and I'm going to only give it a very short lifetime. This one's going to be over on Friday. And that's it. This is the last time, right after you click that button, this is the last time you will see this secret value. Now there's two values here. There's a secret ID, which you do not need, and there's a secret value, which you do need. So make sure you get the secret value and save it at this point. So I'm going to open up, at least for now, just a text document and put that in there so that I have the secret saved for later. I'm going to need it in my Mule application. If you go off of this screen, you lose the value, you're going to have to make a new secret. Now you can always make a new secret anytime you want, but this is the last chance you get to have the secret value. So now we have a way for our Mule application to authenticate to Azure when we go set up the code. It's going to use the client ID, the client secret, and the tenant ID. Now you got to store those in a safe place, and I'm sure you've had other meetups, if not about securing your client secret. This is a very sensitive value because this gets you into Azure. So you could use the default Mule Secure Properties Vault, and that's not the only way, but it's a nice way to secure the secret. So it's encrypted. The other way is to set the secret in runtime manager settings. And if you're in Cloud Hub 1, you can use secure properties setting in your mule artifact.json. And if you're in Cloud Hub 2, there's a checkbox in runtime manager to hide the secure property setting. And that allows you to only provide the secret in your runtime manager and not even have it in your code at all, which is pretty secure. And if you do want to include it in your code, you can encrypt it and use the secure property as well. Be very, I call it security hygiene. You want to be very, I don't know. You always want to make sure you take the low risk option when you're dealing with security features like secrets. So don't write your code the first time and just put it in the code and then later come back and encrypt it. Do it from the beginning. Okay, you're here for a MuleSoft meetup. Let's talk about Mule. So one of the ways you can work with Azure Storage is a MuleSoft certified connector, which is from a company called Coforge, and it used to be called Wishworks. So you may have heard, if you've been using it a while, it was the Wishworks connector. Now it's the Coforge connector. And the Coforge, this has been around a long time. So this is well, one way to connect to Azure Storage. It supports access key or shared access token authentication, and you can authorize by that too. But it does not support using Active Directory, at least not the last time I checked it, which was about a month ago, unless a new version came out. It does support all of the storage account features that are included, blobs and tables. So blobs are in the containers. It supports table storage, queue storage, file storage. So it's pretty nice that way. It supports all the different things that you want to do with your with Mule. Nowadays, you want to use the more MuleSoft recently, just this year, released a connector called the Data Lake connector, and it's a name for the generation 2 features of Azure Storage. It's called Data Lake connector, so you can use that instead. So it's a select connector, which means you don't pay extra for it, and it's supported under your MuleSoft license. And this allows you to access Azure Storage if you have the Data Lake Gen 2 turned on, and only if you have the Data Lake Gen 2 turned on. It does support service principals, but it does not support tables or queues or file shares. It only supports Data Lake Gen 2, which is the blob storage features, which are the ones that I think are the most useful anyway. So I use this connector. It also has a little bit better, it has a feature, more advanced feature that it has access to, which is called lease, which allows you to deal with concurrency concerns by locking. You acquire a lease on a file and other clients cannot overwrite or delete while you're working on it. It's kind of like a lock. So that's kind of nice for when you're building integrations, especially high throughput integrations. That could end up being important if you use, because you could use it for like a lookup table of states to zip codes or something. You can use Data Lake to store all kinds of little data that you need for your application. And if you're going to modify shared data, it might be nice to lock it. Now it's a new connector. It's on a very early version. So currently the way it's designed, upload is a little weird, and I'm going to show you that in your Mule code, right? So this isn't your only option. If you want to work with Data Lake Storage or Azure Storage, you can just use the Azure REST APIs, right? And sometimes if you want to do something that isn't supported by the connector, or you don't like the way the connector does it, you can just use the HTTP connector with OAuth and invoke the REST APIs, and it's a whole lot of code. So the connector is going to be way easier. So if you can use the connector, I recommend doing that. But of course, you can always just use the Azure REST APIs yourself. So we're going to focus on the Data Lake connector and look at what that looks like in a Mule application. So let's go back to our storage account, and we're going to access the Bangalore Meetup storage account with Mule. So I have a API here. Now this API, I don't want to go into any point at the moment, so I'm going to show you. Oh, it's not showing up. I'll just show you here. I made an API that lets you access. The idea was it's an API that's for, you have many users of your website or something, and each user has to upload an avatar image and it needs to display on the screen. So the API lets you get access to the avatar images. And then they can upload various files to their account. So you're going to want to store a bunch of images for each different user account in your Azure, in your blob storage. So in order to use the connector, you see I have the data lake storage connector. You search in Exchange, and you search for, oh, that's why I have the wrong account selected. You got to log into AnyPoint with the proper account. There we go. I make a new trial account for these meetups every month. There we go. And then you can just search for Azure if you don't remember what it's called from the talk, and you'll find all the different Azure connectors. And for me, Data Lake's right at the top. Or you can type in Data Lake and it'll find it. Either way, that'll just find that one. And you add it to your application. Mine's already in, so it's probably not going to add. There we go. So I'm going to hit cancel. You would hit finish, but I've already got mine added. And then you want to work with some basic operations. So if you look at the Azure Data Lake Storage connector, it will it allows you to it calls them file systems, which at first for me was a little confusing. What's going on here? There we go. A file system in the connector is equivalent to a container in Azure Storage. So what I decided to do with this was, whenever a customer is created, we're going to go create a new container for that user, and it's going to use the username for the container name for my little API. And I don't know why my AnyPoint Studio is so slow. Okay, so as soon as you decide to do one of these operations, and I encourage you to build a simple little flow that just creates a file system at first or something, so you can see it work. And then let's look at the global element configuration. So when you first set it up, you need to use a special URL. So I have this from the last meetup. I'm going to change it for you guys. You're going to notice there is a URL here at the top, and it's blank when you first set it up, which is you don't know what to type in, right? So what I'm showing you is there is a suffix, and it's hard to find in the documentation, so I'm telling you about it. It's it's DFS, and I think that stands for distributed file system. It's dfs.core.windows.net. That's what you had to use. I think I found that in the Azure API documentation. And your storage account is going to be the prefix to the URL. So it'll have the host name of your storage account, .dfs.core.windows.net. And it will automatically populate this version, so you don't have to remember that. And then you have to put in your client ID and your client secret. You remember what those are. And then what's really important is this Azure tenant, right? So that tenant is going to be retrieved from your Azure portal. So let me show you again where to get all that stuff. Now I'm going to grant some permissions. I forgot to do that, so we're going to do that together. In order for this storage account to be used by Mule, you're going to have to give the service principals permissions. So we're going to make a role assignment for the new service principal we created. Now, actually, that I've tried this, and it takes longer in the presentation to encrypt things. So I'm going to use my own service principal. So I'm going to add two here. So the first thing is, which role assignment do I need? In Azure, it's kind of like in AnyPoint, we have a control plane and a runtime plane. In Azure, in Microsoft Azure, it's the same thing. They have what they call a management plane, which is this, the portal. And then they have a data plane, which is where our files are going to go. We want to grant permissions in the data plane because we want the actual contents of the storage account to be accessible by Mule. So we're going to choose the, where is it, storage blob data contributor role. That's read and write to the blob storage data. So that's the role we want to grant. And we're going to grant it to the service principal type. There is another type that's very interesting, but we're not going to use that right now. We're going to use service principal. And we're going to add the new service principal we created, which is Bangalore, as one member. And I'm also going to add my local. I have a client app for local as well, because I've already got the client ID and secret in my Anypoint Studio. So we're going to add both of these members to the storage blob data contributor role. So now it actually has permission to work with the storage account. All right, there we go. So these are storage blob data contributors now. And then if you want to get the values you have to put in, remember you go back in Azure Active Directory. Now when I clicked on it, it took me to a different screen called the enterprise application. You can see it here. So that's not going to get me the value I need. So I'm going to go back to the Azure Active Directory and get the values I need. And we'll go to app registrations, which is where my client ID is listed, and my tenant ID, all on one nice screen, which is kind of nice. So here on the Bangalore Service Principal, we're going to get the client ID from here. So client ID would go, in your code, it would go right here, but I have a property for that, right? And then the tenant ID, which is this one, that goes in the URL for the token URL right here. And I have a property for that one. And then you remember where we got the client secret. I saved mine in a text file when you create the secret. So all of that lets the connector be able to connect to the to your storage account in Azure Storage. So I'm going to save that. I'm looking. Let me look at the chat. I don't see. Do I have any questions? Is delay? Okay, I saw that. Thank you. I had to check the chat real quick. All right. So now let's go actually use it. So we're going to go create a file system, and what that's going to do if we create a container for a user. I wonder if I can run it. I decided for this API to name it user dash and the username. So it would be something like after it runs. I'm not sure if it's going to run now. So I'm going to show you what that would do just for the interest of time. So let's bring the meetup back over. Wait a minute. That's the wrong browser. Here we go. Yeah. So we're going to now go back to our Bangalore Meetup 01 container. And when it creates a file system, what you'll end up with in your storage account is a container. And Mule can make these with so if you create file system in Mule, it'll make a new container user dash whoever, like that, right? And then you have a place for blobs to go. So each container acts kind of like a little hard drive, right? Kind of like your D drive or something. Now, my account here doesn't have access to look at Nitish's data. And this is kind of one of the nice things about Azure Storage is you can have segmented security, right? So I can't look at his data, but Mule can, right? Mule's allowed to do that. So let's look at how you would manipulate the data in your application. So let me close these customers flows. And let's just look at a simple thing on retrieving a blob. So within a container, I'll show you in the portal. Let me go to one I have a permission to here. Actually, let's use what we learned and give myself permission right now, just so we have. so I'm going to make myself in the portal a data contributor, and then I can do the same thing as Mule can. So let's do that. Add role assignment.
So Ryan, can this be assumed this blob connector storage as like Ethereum something? Like we can store the data in binary format and we cannot see the data directly on the page. Rather, we can just either upload the data or we can fetch the data, or maybe like object stores.
It is visible. That's
Okay.
different than
Okay.
a Mule object store. You at least there is a permission. The permission I'm about to give myself will let me see real data.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you want to encrypt it before it goes in, then you would do that in your MuleFlow. That way it's not. Now, there's a feature in Azure Storage to do data encryption using certificates, but I don't have that feature, and I don't think that feature works with the connector. I would have to check on that. But yeah, there's a way to connect an Azure Storage account to a Azure Key Vault, and then you can have encryption be done that way. So there's like customer encryption and Microsoft encryption. So you can put customer encryption on top. But I do not know how the connector works if I do that, because I don't see anything in the global element. Where did it go? Yeah, I don't see anything in the global element about the encryption keys. Right, it's just maybe under advanced. Yeah, I doubt that the connector knows how to do that. But I might be wrong, and I would love to see, especially after the recording, if somebody knows that I'm wrong, I'd love to learn how to do that. So yeah, right now the data is visible. So if I go create one, let's go do it. If I go create one in the storage account, let's see, I have about 10 minutes left, right? I like to go to the storage browser, and you can see all the containers. Right, so here's my blob containers, and here's Nitish's. And you can add directories or you can upload files. So we're going to upload an avatar image. I have a couple I was using for fake users when I was getting this ready. Let's see my avatar images. Yeah, unfortunately, you get to have Elmer Fudd. I'm sorry. So we're going to put your avatar image in there. And it gets stored inside the account right there, just like a file, right? So then we want Mule, let's say Mule is going to retrieve that file. The way it would do that is with the read file operation, read path operation, and it's very simple. So you have file systems and paths in the connector. That's what you work with. And so you put the path in of what you want to read, and you put the file system in of what you want to read, and it gives you back a payload of the contents of the file. Perfect. It does support content types. I don't think on a read though. We're going to do that on a write. So now let's look at writing data. If I want to put data in Azure Storage, it's a little more complex. I have to do 3 steps instead of 1. So first I have to create the path in Azure Storage as 1 step. Then, and it's taking Studio a minute to get caught up with me. There we go. So you would tell it whether it's a directory or a file. When you create a path, Azure Storage needs to know which kind of resource it is, directory or file. And I don't know why that pull down is not working. So the 2 options here are file or directory. And then you give it the path name, and then all you've done is created the path, but you haven't put any data there yet. So then after you create the path, you have to do an operation called update path. And update path lets you have choices about what kind of update it is. So I chose the option for appending data. So here under action, you have a list of different actions you can choose. One of them is append, and another one is flush. I think what's happening is my tooling service. I don't know if you guys ever run into that problem in Anypoint Studio. My tooling service is having a hard time here. So it's not resolving this stuff out of the, let's see, did it do it now? No, something's going on with my Anypoint Studio tooling service. So I'm just going to tell you, it could be append, flush, and there's other actions available here. We need append. So we're going to take some data and we're going to append it to the path. And when you do that, you have to tell it what position in the file you're appending, which if you're doing a single payload, you always want to do 0. And then you have to tell it how big the data is as part of the append operation. So you use size of payload so that you can tell it a content length. And that will allow you to do chunk depends. So you can keep appending if you want. I didn't do it that way. I just put the whole payload up there in a single append operation. And then you have to let it know that you're done and do a separate update path operation to flush the data, and that makes it save it to all the way up to the cloud. That actually saves it. So I thought that was kind of a tricky way to upload data to Azure Storage, and I hope the connector has an improvement someday to make it better. So right now, if you're going to use the connector, this is how you do it, and maybe, hopefully, future versions of the connector won't be so complicated. But that's the only thing that was complicated. Everything else was pretty easy. So I wanted to make sure I included that in the talk, so that when you do updates, whenever you're uploading data, you have to do a 3-step process. Um, I have a little pattern I did here, and I just learned this by working with the connector. The errors that come out of the connector when you have problems aren't that useful, at least in the error description. Mule errors have a type and a description. I wanted the payload, because the actual response body from the Azure API gives you way better errors. So I just put an on error propagate on all my flows that use Azure Storage, and I turn off the logging that comes with it right here, and I put my own logger in that just gives me the error message .payload, and that way, and it really only is useful for the Azure Data Lake Storage connector. So I probably should make this a propagate that's just for that connector, but I didn't. I just did it for the whole flow. But anyway, this will give you a much better message whenever you have errors with the connector. Let's see if there's anything else to show you. I had the whole thing implemented where you list, you do uploads. The rest of it is, we've already seen the patterns. So I think that's probably good. The only demo I didn't do in my code here is the lease. And if you have a concurrency concern, like the way I designed my API, every user has their own container. So I didn't have any concurrency issues. But if you are having all the users share one, then you might want to use lease path in order to acquire locks on the blobs before you operate on them. So that's what I have prepared. I think we can I have a little time left for questions and stuff. Anything you wanted to put in chat? But thank you for hosting me at your meetup and letting me meet all you wonderful people from the other side of the world.
Definitely, sure, sure, sure. And